is recognized.
I want to thank Chairman McHenry and Ranking Member Waters for holding the hearing, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being with us today. Secretary Yellen, on November 4th, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund released a new proposed CDFI certification application using the Paperwork Reduction Act. Why did the CDFI Fund use the Paperwork Reduction Act instead of the Administrative Procedures Act for that change?
I'm not sure. I assume because the Paperwork Reduction Act requires examination of forms.
But I would note that the Paperwork Reduction Act was enacted to minimize the paperwork burden for stakeholders. The CDFI fund won't meet with interested parties while the proposal is pending because of a blackout period. And as I'm sure you are aware, there's significant concern that the change will make it very difficult and, in fact, potentially exclude many current CDFIs from participation in that program. Secretary Yellen, what is the statutory justification for this blackout period?
I can't tell you about the blackout period, but I know that what the CDFI fund is doing is attempting to update a certification process that hasn't been really reviewed in more than 25 years.
And I would submit that may be appropriate, but the Administrative Procedures Act, I think, would be the more appropriate pathway for that and certainly would allow the kind of comment that I think the current proposed change really is screaming out for. Secretary Yellen, Jody Harris has recently stepped down as director from the CDFI fund. Given the mismanagement of the fund, someone with more expertise on the regulatory environment and safety and soundness expectations inside the CDFI fund would be incredibly helpful. Could you speak to Treasury's perspective on appointing a director with meaningful experience with insured depositories and consumer finance, and what other considerations you think are important to finding the right person to head up the fund going forward?
Well, we will certainly do a thorough search. The director of the CDFI fund is a career SES position, and in filling that job, we're governed by the Civil Service Reform Act, so it has to be based on merit, and there needs to be a competition with multiple candidates considered.
Thank you.
So, you know.
Well, thank you. I just hope you understand the turmoil that this has created among CDFIs across the country and the attendant impact that that's having on communities that are supposed to be being served by these important institutions. I want to shift gears. On Tuesday, March 21st, you suggested that deposits would be covered by federal insurance, quote, if smaller institutions suffer deposit runs that pose the risk of contagion, close quote. Before the Senate the next day, you said you had not considered, quote, blanket insurance or guarantees of deposits, close quote. But a day later, before the House, you said the Treasury, quote, would be prepared to take additional actions if warranted, close quote. Secretary Yellen, can you clarify Treasury's position on any sort of expansion of deposit insurance?
I'm sorry, I never intended to suggest that we were proposing expanding deposit insurance. Over time, that might be something the FDIC has issued a report, and it might be an appropriate topic to look at. But what I said was that I was prepared to work with other regulators, the FDIC and the Fed, to take actions similar to those we took in the case of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank to protect depositors when there was a risk of systemic contagion of bank runs, and that those tools would be available. And it could be the case that with a community bank that that a run on a community bank, if it were judged that it could trigger broader systemic runs on other sound banks, it could also be appropriate to use those same tools.
Well, I will just say, as a board member of a community bank, I hope you keep in mind how important our community banks are to our rural communities and small communities across the country. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's